to introduce Dr. Tamara Chaplin Matheson. Can you hear me? Is that all right? Yeah. All right. So, who is an assistant professor of modern European history at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. She received her PhD from Rutgers in 2002, where she studied under the eminent historians Bonnie Smith and Joan Scott, among others, and earned her bachelor's degree from Concordia University in Montreal. Now, over the last few years, Dr. Matheson has published several articles that have established her as one of the leading young scholars in the field of French intellectual history, a position that has thus far earned her an invitation to speak at the Sorbonne and a prestigious visiting fellowship at New York University's Institute for French Studies in spring 2005. Now, her first book, which will have the same title as today's talk, that is, Turning on the Mind, French Philosophers and Television, will be out from the University of Chicago Press this fall. Matheson's work provides an intriguing new perspective on a particularly important aspect of 20th century French history, that is, the role of the intellectual as a public figure in French life. Those of you who are from my History 202 class will remember that excerpt from Zola's editorial J'accuse in the Dreyfus Affair, which is widely seen as the birth of this character, the public intellectual in France. In any event, in France today, philosophers have really managed to attain a degree of celebrity that might strike Americans as surprising. During their lifetimes, thinkers like Jean Baudrillard, Jacques Derrida, and Jean-Paul Sartre were bona fide stars whose comments on the events of the day were presented frequently in mainstream newspapers and, yes, on television. Dr. Matheson's work analyzes this phenomenon and explains why it is that practitioners of what can often be a very esoteric discipline have become such important fixtures in mainstream French cultural life as it's developed since the Second World War. Now, before I turn the podium over to our speaker, I'd like to thank all the organizations that have made this talk possible. The Western European Studies Program, the Iowa State French Club, the Departments of Philosophy, World Languages and Culture, and History, the Greenlee School of Journalism and Communication, the F. Wendell Miller Trust, and the GSB Lectures Program. And now, Dr. Matheson, the floor is yours.
Good evening. Get that down to my level. Good evening. Let me begin by thanking John Monroe and Iowa State University for inviting me to come and speak to you this evening, and to all of you thank you for taking the time to attend my talk. It's a privilege and a pleasure for me to be here. For the past 10 years, I have been grappling to understand a peculiarly French phenomenon. 50 years of the televising of philosophy and philosophers in France. Between 1951, when Jean-Paul Sartre first appeared on television news, and the end of the century, over 3,500 television programs have aired in France featuring philosophers or their work. And here we have a graphic representation of that. Now, to North American eyes like my own, and possibly to yours as well, this is an absolutely startling phenomenon, very unusual. It also complicates arguments by post-war intellectuals, people like Theodore Adorno, and French scholars like Pierre Bourdieu, about fundamental oppositions between high and popular culture. And it contradicts the argument that television is inherently anti-intellectual, that it is a menace to democracy, culture, and moral values, and that it is the unabashed arch enemy of the book. So why were the French so interested in philosophy and philosophers? And what does it mean to actually do philosophy on TV? Is it even possible? My work uses the unlikely domain of the televising of philosophy. Here we have some images from the various kinds of shows, different people, in order to claim that if we are to comprehend the ways in which ideas, images, and especially identities, national identities, are vested in contemporary history, we ignore the medium of television at our peril. In my talk today, I'm going to make three major arguments. First, in the aftermath of World War II. You're all so good, you're starting to write right now. Excellent. French state television deployed philosophers as a metonym for French national grandeur. So philosophers represent French national grandeur. Second, by the mid-1960s, the televising of philosophy became a vital, if problematic, tool for the assimilation of an increasingly diverse post-colonial public. Third, during the 1970s and 80s, philosophers used the small screen to demand political and ethical accountability, revalidating their own importance as public intellectuals and advancing intellectual power. Now, this assertion that they used TV in the 70s and 80s to reassert their power contradicts a prevailing thesis of cultural decline that speculates that during these same years, the rise of the media intellectual, the so-called mediocrity, sounded the death knell for intellectual culture in France. Now, neither the Renaissance in political philosophy nor the fascination with ethics, which are evident in France at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st, are explicable without reference to this history. So in order to explore these claims about national grandeur, about philosophy as a tool for post-colonial assimilation, and about public intellectuals using TV to call for political and ethical accountability, I'm going to bring your attention to 3 moments in French television history. The first one is a 1957 broadcast of a French philosopher whose name was Gaston Bachelard. Bachelard, B-A-C-H-E-L-A-R-D. Okay. He's a philosopher of science. Then we're going to look at educational programming on philosophy, which is produced during the 1960s. So television, like educational programming shows kind of the Sesame Street variety of things in a French version. And then we're going to look at a philosopher named Michel Foucault, who appeared on television in 1976 to talk about a book that was very popular called The History of Sexuality, Volume 1. And he appeared on a show called Apostrophe, which was a television book show where people came on to talk about books. Okay. So, following the liberation from German occupation in 1944, France was eclipsed on the world stage by the rise of the USA and the USSR. And it was eager to sort of erase its collaborationist past and to regain a place in the global balance of power. French existentialism was generating international interest, and the state saw philosophers as a sort of very valuable form of French cultural capital. Now, they knew that television didn't exert much influence beyond national borders. We didn't have satellite or anything like that, right? But they believed that the medium had great potential to reconfirm French greatness to domestic audiences. And by the 1950s, broadcast coverage of famous people like Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, and Simone de Beauvoir was exploited as a visible sign of French renewal. And we can see here 2 images from when Camus accepts the Nobel Prize, and this was televised in 1957, and when Sartre refuses the Nobel Prize later in 1964. Now, television tried to sort of avoid political controversy at this time, so it presented philosophers as cultural jet-setters, as celebrities. Okay? And in this way, it rendered them as a sort of corporeal synecdoche for a specifically French form of national glamour and intellectual power. And this process sort of demonstrates my first point, and it is exemplified in coverage of Gaston Bachelard on a renowned book show called Lecture pour tous, which means reading for all. And this book show started airing in 1953, and it aired for 15 years, and it was incredibly popular in France. It's also the first time that they ever discussed philosophy on TV. So here, this man with the beard is Gaston Bachelard, young, with his daughter. Now, who is this guy? He was born in 1884 into a working class family. His father ran a tabac. His grandfather was actually a shoemaker. He had a career as a postmaster. Then he worked for the electric company. He went to war during World War I and fought in the trenches. But in midlife, he taught himself philosophy, and he passed the state's highest exam in philosophy and completed a doctoral thesis on epistemology at the age of 43. Eventually, he advanced to the chair in the history and philosophy of science at the Sorbonne. By the time of his death, so this is from like 1943 until his death, he had produced over 90 publications, including 23 books. So this is a guy who didn't have trouble like finishing his essays or getting tenure or anything like that, right? We should all emulate this kind of productivity. The philosopher was also featured or discussed on television 57 times between the first time he appeared in 1956 and the end of the century. And here we sort of have a basic graph showing different television coverage of various people. We can see that Jean-Paul Sartre, who's the most famous, is over 500 appearances between 51 and 99. BHL, his name is actually Bernard-Henri Lévy. He's sort of a celebrity philosopher in France. Then we have Camus, Raymond Aron, Michel Foucault, and Bachelard down at the bottom there, but still a significant number of appearances. Now, his iconic image quickly embodied the very essence of philosophy for the viewing public. And here we can see what he looks like. He certainly looks like a philosopher to me. Here he is on a show called 5 colonnes à la une, which is sort of like banner headlines. This broadcast footage, which was shot just prior to his death, actually aired numerous times, over 20 times. It was rebroadcast on French television after that. And it's now considered a classic of early French TV. It was also the first of over 80 documentaries on philosophers, on the lives of philosophers that was produced for French television. So let's talk about the first show that made him a sort of television icon. Here's this book show, Reading for All. This guy's the host of it, Pierre Dumayet. And here's Dumayet talking about the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the show that Bachelard is invited on the air for. Now, one thing we need to know when we're talking about television in France is that at this time there is one channel in France. All television is public. There's no private television. Okay? So the second channel isn't launched until 1964. The third channel is launched in 1972. This means until 1984, you only have 3 channels in France. Okay? You turn on your television, if you've got a philosopher on channel 1 and you only have one channel, you watch it, right? You don't have a lot of choice. You can't click. And television doesn't privatize in France until it actually legally in 82, but in 84 we get the first cable network. Okay, so this is a really sort of restricted state program for what the state wants its audience to be watching, and that's really important. By 1962, almost 40% of French homes had televisions. And Lecture pour tous, this show, was capturing about 32% of the viewing public, which is pretty high ratings. So according to this guy, Pierre Dumayet, okay, the thing that was so attractive about this book show is that you'd invite these authors on to talk about their work, and you would learn something by how they presented themselves, right? Verbally and physically, that you couldn't learn just by reading the material. So the program sort of exemplifies what were the tripartite aims of French television during this time. And those aims were to inform, to educate, and to entertain. They're actually the same as the BBC in London. Okay, so that's the goal of television at this time. And of course, we can see the entertain comes last. Right? It also, on this show, is going to sort of trumpet the importance of philosophy in French culture at a time when philosophy is under siege within the academy. And I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. So on this show, Bachelard is invited to represent one of 61 philosophers who have contributed to this encyclopedia of philosophy. And when the show opens, we see Dumayet, who I actually interviewed when he was like close to 90 years old, a couple of years ago in France. It was very fascinating. He's sort of hefting this big volume towards the audience and saying, you know, there's weighty significance here. This is really important, right? And Dumayet introduces his guests to the camera, and then we get a long shot of all 3 of these men along with Gaston Berger, who is another philosopher and who had actually edited the volume. Okay? And Berger explains that this text is sort of an introductory overview to philosophy and philosophers. The encyclopedia also covers religion, but they don't talk about religion at all, interestingly. Okay? Here we have some of their comments. Right? Philosophy is the affair of each one of us. This book surpasses readers who are purely and simply philosophers. What hit me about this enormous volume is that it is readable. We can see that what they're trying to convince the public of is that all of you can really read this stuff, and it's going to be fascinating. You're going to be really interested in it. Okay? So, as the program progresses, the camera keeps going back to Gaston Bachelard. And when it ends, the segment ends on a close-up of his image. Now, his presence on the show is really interesting because he wasn't particularly famous at the time to a broader public. He's not asked about what he wrote for the volume at all. Okay? He's not well known to general French audiences. But his physical presence, which is so suggestive of the classical image of the philosopher. If we need to hammer it home, we can look at him next to Socrates, here, right? It performs a crucial function. He is, I argue, the representational embodiment of philosophy. Philosophy signified. Through his physiognomy alone, through the way he looks, he links contemporary discussions of philosophy to this sort of revered classical past. And in doing this, his image serves him and his personal notoriety, but it also acts as a symbolic site for the national affirmation of an endangered cultural ideal. So when I say this, what do I mean? An endangered cultural ideal. Philosophy is in danger at this moment in France. Why? To explain this claim, we're going to return for a moment to the historical context. By the 1950s, right, we're after the war, the French state is struggling with the debacle of the Algerian War, right? French is an imperial power. It has a colony in Algeria. It's been at war with this colony from 1954 to 1962. And during this 8-year struggle to try and keep Algeria French, the Fourth Republic, which is the government in power, is destroyed. It brings General de Gaulle to power as a president and initiates the Fifth Republic. It also becomes one of the bloodiest examples of decolonization on record. There's a lot of torture that goes on the part of the French. When Algeria is finally granted independence in 1962, and here we have the cover of the New York Times, the Evian Accords mark the end of this war, and we can actually see de Gaulle on television. The picture shows him on television because he uses TV a lot to sort of get his political message out there, right? We know that for the French, the notion of sort of ethical redemption is key. They've really sullied their image by the way in which they tried to hang on to Algeria. So there's, once again, this need for a revitalized drive for French cultural supremacy, right, which is going to serve as a sort of salve for wounded national pride. And these various threats, which are being posed to the nation by decolonization, by something called coca-colonization. I don't know if any of you have heard that term yet. Coca-colonization, this is America taking over the world, right? These kinds of threats, right, by the threat of European integration, make the definition and the cultural acquisition of Frenchness, what does it mean to be French, okay, all the more important. And many people, many intellectuals, believed that philosophy was going to be an important tool for young people and for the general public to sort of grapple with these pressures, right? It would restore national dignity, and it would inculcate in them the capacity not only for autonomous critical thinking, because philosophy is going to teach you to think critically and to be like a good citizen, a good member of the population, but also it's actually going to make you French. If you learn philosophy, you will be French. Now we need to remember that France teaches philosophy in high school. Okay, so all high school students study philosophy, and this means that if you're in the general public, right, you know something about philosophy, and you might actually be a little bit more interested in it if you see it on television. But at the same time, we have France modernizing, right? We have this new drive for technology, and we get sort of a conflict between tradition and technology at this point. We also have a baby boom in the post-war period. We have an absolutely rapidly expanding student population, right? The student population triples. If you can imagine in the 1960s, in 10 years, if in 10 years your student population tripled on this campus, what would you do with all those students, right? You have this just massive expansion in the demographics. And consequently, this propels a crisis between education as a sort of intellectual, moral training and education as a vocational school, right? We see that today. How many of you are here thinking, I need a vocational education, I need to get a career afterwards, right? I need a job, right? I can't think about just educating myself. Okay, so we have this sort of struggle between these two attitudes towards what education should do. And professionals and professors, okay, believed that state-directed television could be used to colonize the intimate spaces of the private sphere, because it goes right into your living room, right? And it could be used as a means for philosophy's dissemination. Television would ensure that tradition and philosophy, and consequently the moral health and the unity of the nation, would survive. But how are they planning to actually achieve this end? How are they going to do this? Okay? I mean, how can public TV actually work as a force for national unity? Well, some of the most remarkable examples of this agenda were broadcast between 1964 and 1969 in, and yeah, we're about to go to, you can change us to the next screen, the channel, yeah. As part of a collection of 40 broadcasts called The Teaching of Philosophy. Now, just give me a sec before we go to that, okay? These shows were conceived by a woman named Dina Dreyfus, who actually happened to be the first wife of Claude Lévi-Strauss. Maybe some of you have heard of Claude Lévi-Strauss. He was a famous anthropologist. Okay? And they were intended to be viewed in high school classrooms. So what I'm about to show you is for the high school, but it was broadcast nationally. Okay? And it featured some of France's greatest living philosophers, people like Foucault, like Alain Badiou, who's now very famous, Raymond Aron, Jean Hippolyte, Georges Canguilhem, Paul Ricoeur, Pierre Bourdieu, names that you may or may not know. But these are very famous people in France, and they were all in these broadcasts. Now I'm going to show you the 90-second credit sequence that opens the broadcast for the 1964-65 season. Okay? And I'm going to suggest to you that when we watch it, it captures the pedagogical objectives, okay, of 6 years of philosophical programming in France, and it sort of illustrates how the televising of philosophy is going to be used to sort of shore up French national identity. So let's take a look at that now. I don't know how hard you have to hit that button to make sure it should work. I don't know if we can get our, it should come on in a second. Is it working?
I think so.
Yeah? I'm going to hit play again. Hit harder.
Okay.
Ah, yes, good. I wonder if we can turn the volume. It's those two little buttons, yeah.
Or, c'est proprement avoir les yeux fermés sans tâcher jamais de les ouvrir, disait Descartes, que de vivre sans philosopher.
Il y a une vie de la philosophie hors de la classe, une cité des philosophes qui l'englobe et la nourrit.
So we hit stop. Okay. Go back to our other. Great. There we go. Good. Okay, so what are we supposed to make of this sequence? Right? In less than 90 seconds, we have the camera situating youthful fascination with philosophy within the legacy of a venerable tradition, right? These individuals, as they are depicted, are equally significant. Got something going off down here. I'm not sure what it, hold on a second. All right, I'm back. Okay, so who did we see in this thing, right? We saw old people, we saw young people, we saw men, women, we saw whites, blacks, Arabs, Asians, right? The people who are speaking, the mature figures, okay, are mostly white and male, and I'm going to come back to this, okay? Now, mixed gender lycées, high schools, okay, where we see both girls and boys, were actually established in 1925. So the fact that we see young girls studying philosophy is not very surprising, okay? Especially because after the 1950s, there are more and more girls in philosophy classes because boys are going into the mathematics and the sciences as France is starting to modernize, okay? So the humanities are feminizing at this moment. But the fact that we see all of these racially diverse images is kind of surprising, and it raises some questions for us, right? Through the 1970s, most broadcast coverage of non-European immigrants has only focused on social problems, employment, housing, racism, okay? The immigrant is not presented as a subject. He's presented as an object, okay? Immigrant families, children, young people, they're almost absent from the small screen. So the fact that we were seeing people, and I hope you noticed, like, here we had this Asian boy, for example, who was reading a philosophy text, okay, is really important. And what I'm going to argue is that this underscores the importance of philosophy to this new multi-ethnic public in a post-colonial moment. So following decolonization, we have all these new people coming into France. And it betrays anxieties about national integration. How are we going to make all these people really feel French? Okay? At the same time, it gives us a sense of equality of opportunity, right? All of these people come here, they're going to study, and they're going to be just as French as we are, supposedly. Okay? So it gives us some sort of access to Frenchness. And it also has all of these locations. In a cafe, we saw the street signs, things like that. We have this image of the Sorbonne, right? Which also tell us that philosophy, even though it might be universal as a discipline, is actually really fundamentally sort of Parisian and French, and that you can access it if you live here in this country. So the woman, Dina Dreyfus, who had produced these, she really wanted to emphasize to people that philosophy is sort of a living activity, right? And that it is something that is born in community, and that it is developed through dialogue. But given its oral roots, the question remains, why not just put it on the radio, right? Why are we televising it? Is there really something for us to see here? I mean, what is important about this? Okay, so we're going to take a look at one of the shows. And you have to remember, these are shows that are broadcast to high school students, okay? So we're going to go back to another sequence. And this show is called Philosophy and Truth. And it's from the 6th show of the 1964-65 season. You have to imagine you're all in a classroom with your professor and you're watching this on a Wednesday morning. Should be, there we go. Excellent.
Non, non pourrait pas courir. Ça me paraîtrait presque grossier, car les vulnérables à l'intérieur d'un système philosophique.
Est-ce que vous considérez qu'il n'y a pas de vérité philosophique? Vous allez nous scandaliser, là.
C'est Georges Canguilhem.
Je ne pense pas que je vous scandaliserai, vous, personnellement. Je dirais qu'il n'y a pas de vérité philosophique. La philosophie n'est pas un genre de spéculation dont la valeur puisse être mesurée par le vrai et le faux.
Moi, je suis tout à fait d'accord avec ce que tu as dit. Il n'y a aucune contradiction entre ce que tu as dit. Il n'y a de vérité que scientifique et ce que j'ai dit. Il n'y a pas d'erreur, hélas peut-être, en philosophie.
Oui, la philosophie a toujours été
philosopher named Paul Ricoeur.
Pour la clarification, pour la cohérence. Et à ce titre, c'est une œuvre de langage particulière et privilégiée. C'est dans la réflexion philosophique, dans la spéculation philosophique, que tous les problèmes de signe, de sens, des autres disciplines viennent se réfléchir.
We have Dreyfus on the far side. She produced them. And Michel Foucault on the left. He still has hair here. It's kind of interesting. The owl of Minerva. It's a symbol of wisdom. Okay, so the broadcast ultimately comes to no definitive conclusions. It's, of course, longer than that. I've excerpted it. But the lack of closure in these philosophy programs is sort of characteristic. And it's also something that we would call heuristically useful. Okay? Because professors would use it to generalize opposing views for debate inside of the classroom. Is there truth and error in philosophy or not? What do we mean by that? Okay? But what we get from the images is, again, this notion that philosophy is sort of a constant conversation in France, right? That philosophers are these real, living, breathing people. They take taxis, they wear overcoats, they smoke cigarettes, and they have discussions just like the rest of us do. So in this sense, we get the notion that this visual dimension is really crucial to it. But there's also a really important disjuncture at play. Because with these white men as sort of masters, right, the program belies the invitation. It contradicts the invitation of the opening credits, okay, which are sort of presenting philosophy as available to everyone. And what it's actually showing is that this discourse is really traditional, it's patriarchal, it's Western, it's white, and it's fundamentally, again, French. So this image of the master thinker that's captured on camera, okay, shapes the message of the broadcasts just as much as those opening credits do, those multiracial faces in the opening credits. And this is a contradiction that really captures a tension that is inherent in the project of post-colonial assimilation. Okay? How do you reconcile a sort of mythic image of your country, France, as elite, as hierarchical, and as traditional, with this new ideal which is inclusive and egalitarian and modern? Okay? And we sort of see that playing out here. Now I'm going to take us to point 3. The notion that philosophers as public intellectuals are going to be intervening on matters of political and ethical importance. And we want to remember that the French concept of this political, committed public intellectual took its modern form, as your professor suggested, Dr. Monroe, during the Dreyfus Affair, okay, at the end of the 19th century. But in many ways, French philosophers have embodied this ideal since the Enlightenment, right? But it's not until the liberalization of the French audiovisual landscape in the 1970s, move forward here, and this happens after some enormous riots, that philosophers are able to exercise sort of political liberty on television. And what this image says is the police are at the Office de la Radio-Télévision Française, which means that they are at, it's like saying the police are at ABC or the police are at CBS. The police are in your home, okay? And what it mean, and that says this is the police chez vous or in your home, okay? Which means basically that the state is controlling what's on television, okay? So it's an anti-censorship image there. Now, at this moment, what we see is a move towards liberalization in television. And we also see that there's a new interest in ethical questions in the general public. Now, what do we mean by that? Ethical questions. These are questions about the difference between right and wrong, between good and bad, between duty and the law and virtue. And one of the things that is apparent is that these ethical questions are particularly pressing in France in the 1960s, as they are in many places in the world. Okay? There are all sorts of disputes going on about abortion, about immigration, about feminism, about gay rights. about the environment as we move into the late 60s and early 70s, about neo-racism, the emergence of new forms of racism, right? About the Holocaust, about the death of communism and Marxism. I mean, is this a good thing or a bad thing, right? And for many people, here we see some sort of images of these various ethical issues that are happening. We have some Albanian immigrants, this sign that says, "My body belongs to me," this from the French feminist movement, this cartoon of Le Pen, who runs the New Right party in France, and it says, this goes quite nicely with flambéed, sort of, or smoking synagogue. So we see the emergence of new racisms here. And what we see is that television is going to play a really vital part in giving the public new tools for dealing with all of these ethical disputes, especially in the aftermath of this major crisis that happens in France in 1968, right? When 10 million people go on strike. Hard to imagine, 10 million people on strike, okay, as a result of these student revolutions. So we have really a national crisis, and it's in the aftermath of this that we start to see intellectuals on television taking political stands. And one of the places where that happens is on another book show, which also ran for 15 years, which is called Apostrophe. And this is the guy, Bernard Pivot, who hosted that show. So in order to think about that, I'm going to look at a little bit more TV footage of a very famous philosopher whose name is Michel Foucault. Not quite yet. Just one sec. Now, this show is really, really important. A lot of people complained about it because it seemed to have a sort of stranglehold over the book market. Basically, if you were an author and you were invited on this show, your book sold to a lot of people. It's kind of like Oprah. You know how she would choose best book and then everybody would go out there and buy it? Well, for example, we have this man, Vladimir Yankelovich. You can see he's a very old man here, right? He was invited on television in 1980 to talk about a book that he had published. And he was 76 years old. And in the week after he was on the air, he sold 30,000 books. This was more books than he had sold in his entire lifetime. Right? So we can really see the impact of television. It's changing how the public is actually absorbing intellectual information. And so it's very controversial. Now, in 1976, this famous philosopher named Michel Foucault is invited on to talk about this book that he publishes called The History of Sexuality. And the show is called What is the Future of Man? And it's broadcast live. And in this instance, it's actually broadcast from the Louvre. Okay, so famous museum, they're in the Sumerian room at the Louvre, they have live chamber music playing Rachmaninoff at the beginning of it, and we're going to take a look at the very first moments of that broadcast when he's been invited on to talk about his book. Push again. There we go. Left. Stop.
Le philosophe, maintenant, va avoir la parole. Alors, le philosophe, je l'ai invité, c'est Michel Foucault, je l'ai invité pour son premier volume, La volonté de savoir, premier volume de son histoire de la sexualité, mais il m'a dit, moi, je n'en parle pas de ce bouquin-là, je préfère parler d'un autre. Alors, pourquoi vous ne voulez pas parler de votre livre?
Eh bien, je ne vais pas parler du mien pour une raison. Première raison, c'est qu'au fond, on écrit des choses un peu parce qu'on les pense, mais aussi beaucoup pour ne plus les penser. Et puis ensuite...
Oui, il est philosophe.
Et puis ensuite, je crois que quand on termine un livre, enfin terminer un livre, c'est ne plus pouvoir le voir. Tant qu'on aime encore un petit peu son livre, on l'écrit. Une fois qu'on a cessé de l'aimer, on cesse de l'écrire.
Okay, if you can stop. Stop the tape first, did you?
Yes, I have.
Okay, good. Thanks. Okay, so what does Foucault want to talk about, right? He's live on the air. He says, thanks for inviting me, but I really don't want to talk about my book. I want to talk about something else. Okay, what he wants to talk about is a problem that's going on in the Soviet Union. There's a doctor who's been arrested. His name is Dr. Stern, okay? And he's arrested by the KGB in 1974. And he's been prosecuted for sexual misconduct and for perversion and fraud. And this affair, okay, is also connected to a real interest in the question of Soviet dissidence, which is emerging in the West after the French translation of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's book, The Gulag Archipelago, which maybe some of you have heard of. Okay? Now, Dr. Stern is a member of the Communist Party, but he's also a Jew. Okay? And he had been denounced because he had refused to dissuade his sons from trying to emigrate to Israel. Okay? So he's arrested on a whole series of charges, and they're all trumped-up charges. Okay? And at the trial, he's sentenced to 8 years of forced labor in a penal camp in Kharkov. It's like going to Siberia, essentially. And his sons are fighting for his release. Now, the Stern affair, this whole affair, becomes really important because it participates in a debate in the French media at this time that had come about because of the publication of Solzhenitsyn's book. Now, why are the French interested in critiquing totalitarianism in the 1970s? Partially because in French politics, there's an alliance in 1972 between the communists and the socialists called the Union of the Left. And the people who are in power, okay, who are not on the left, are afraid that if the left comes to power, the communists are going to take over France. So they're trying to discredit communism and totalitarianism, okay? And Foucault is also very anti-communist, and so he's invested in this controversy, on the one hand, politically. He wants to talk about it on television because he's interested in discrediting sort of Stalin and the Gulag and the whole communist totalitarian situation that's now emerging in the USSR. Of course, this is after Stalin, but anyhow. At the same time, what he does when he's talking about Dr. Stern is he uses it to talk about all of the philosophical ideas that he expresses in his book, The History of Sexuality. So, not quite yet. Okay, ultimately, his discussion of the Stern affair, okay, hits all of the main themes of the history of sexuality, which is interested in sort of medical discourse, discourses about the prison and about sexuality, okay, about the way that power and knowledge come together and how they produce our ideas about truth. So he's talking about these things by talking about the Stern affair. So in one way, he's using something which is very popular in the media to also get his own philosophical ideas out there to the general public. Okay. Now, he's using this major media event to drive home a political narrative, his sort of political perspective, but also his ethical perspective, and also his philosophical perspective. And he's doing this in contradiction to what many people think is, well, television is now controlling how intellectuals are seen in the public eye, okay? But he's saying, no, I'm going to use television to do my thing, like to put my agenda out there, okay? So that's a really good example, what happens on this particular show, of how intellectuals are also deploying the media for their own ends. It's not uniquely sort of just TV controlling how intellectuals are seen by the general public. Now, a lot of times there's a big debate in France about the role of intellectuals on the media and whether or not the media has sort of denigrated their status in the public sphere. One thing that is true is that the media does shape how we understand people. So, for example, Foucault died of AIDS in 1984. And a lot of the television coverage that we see of him after 1984 is linking his memory to AIDS. Okay? What's really interesting is that he never publicly avowed the fact that he was homosexual when he was in France. And he never really talked about gay rights or anything like that. But after his death, this becomes an important way for the public to understand him as a gay man who was a homosexual, died of AIDS, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we can see that the media works both ways. Sometimes intellectuals can use the media for their own agendas. Sometimes the media uses its own agenda to shape how the public understands intellectuals. Now, some people would say that basically the effects of television are inherently negative for intellectual and cultural life. And we see this in statements like this, which we get from a very prominent intellectual named Regis Debray, who's sort of parodying. You know, he says, now that's my idea of a philosopher. And this is a very sort of popular philosopher named Bernard-Henri Lévy, okay? You know, and someone says to him, well, did his ideas convince you? And they're like, no, but just look at him. I mean, he looks like a philosopher. It's sort of back to Bachelard, right? He looks like a philosopher. We should trust this guy, okay? And this is obviously a critique of what television can do. But another thing, of course, is that people are afraid of the way that television is now controlling the commercial market. right? It has tremendous power to shape intellectual life. Then again, as Foucault himself says, I shall never be convinced that a book is bad just because its author has been seen on television. But of course, it isn't good for that reason alone either. Now, drained of political valence by a controlling government, during the 1950s, philosophy on TV served as a sort of abstract symbol of French cultural regeneration. And it promotes this universal, patriarchal vision of French cultural superiority. In the 1960s, television turned to philosophy to try and pacify the tensions of a post-colonial public. And once television liberalized in the aftermath of the student revolutions of 1968, we can see that philosophers are starting to acknowledge some of these tensions and contradictions that have been existing in French history in the post-war moment, and assuming a public role as mediatic intellectuals on the small screen. By the 1980s, French TV becomes one of the most important platforms for philosophy in France. And during the 1990s, it's remarkable, 8 new shows on philosophy. These are like not individual programs, but actual series, are produced between 1994 and 1997 on French television, including a sitcom called La Philo selon Philippe, which means philosophy according to Philippe, which actually takes place sort of like Beverly Hills 90210. It's about high school students in a high school philosophy class, okay? So you see this real popularization of philosophy, and we have philosophy cafes where people go and talk about philosophy in cafes, and we have philo cabinet, which is where you would go and instead of seeing a psychologist, you would actually go and consult a philosopher who's going to tell you, read Socrates, he will solve your depression, or whatever, right? And then we get sort of the American follow-up to that, where we get books like From Plato to Prozac. I think that's the correct. It's either Prozac to Plato or Plato to Prozac, but it's, you know, this sort of notion that if we read philosophy, it'll solve our problems. Okay? So one of the things that I'm arguing is that television has a really important role to play in helping to bring philosophy into the public sphere in France and actually to change the way that philosophy is done. It popularizes it, and it gives us a new form of philosophy, which is sort of what we might call philosophy light. Right? It's popular philosophy for the masses. It's going to solve your social and ethical and moral problems. And of course, this is important because at this moment, right, in the aftermath of 1989, what happened in 1989? Fall of the Berlin Wall, end of communism in Eastern Europe. Many people say sort of an end of ideologies, a crisis. We have world secularization going on. It's interesting because now we're sort of getting back to religion. But people are looking for, what is it? How do we know how to act in this world where all of these things that we had believed in for so long are really changing? And one of the things that we can see is that for the French, at least, philosophy becomes an important way of doing that. Now, I think, sort of to close, I want us to look at one final clip of Michel Foucault, okay? Because one of the big critiques of philosophy on TV is that it's not possible for us to really talk about intellectual ideas on television because television is antithetical to that. Television is all about sound bites and short blips. So let's look at philosophy on TV in Foucault, and this is, again, back to that program from 1976 where he's talking about the Stern affair, but then he returns at the end to talking about his own work.
Et c'est une question il y a juste 10 ans, et vous écriviez, l'homme, c'est peut-être une bonne fin pour l'émission, c'est la fin. L'homme n'est pas le plus vieux problème, ni le plus constant qui soit posé au savoir humain. Et il ajoutait, il faudrait lire dans toute la page, mais enfin, l'homme est une invention dont l'archéologie de notre pensée montre aisément la date récente et peut-être la fin prochaine.
Oui, parce qu'il m'a semblé en effet que le moment où l'homme avait commencé à devenir un problème à la fois philosophique, mais également technique, politique, économique pour lui-même, ce moment n'était pas aussi ancien qu'on pouvait l'imaginer. Bon, bien sûr, il y a les fameuses et traditionnelles questions que nous connaissons. Si vous voulez, moi je crois qu'à partir d'un certain moment, on peut situer entre la fin du XVIe siècle et le début du XIXe, il s'est passé un phénomène important. même, c'est que l'homme a cessé d'être immédiatement dominé par les grandes menaces de la mort. C'est-à-dire par les menaces des épidémies, des famines, des formidables ravages de la mortalité infantile, et que l'homme a en quelque sorte disposé des sociétés humaines. Je parle uniquement d'ailleurs de l'Occident, mais c'est là où les choses se sont que les sociétés occidentales ont commencé à disposer d'une espèce de marge de survie, à partir duquel l'homme est devenu relativement disponible par rapport à ces urgences fondamentales ou à ces grandes menaces de la mort qui avaient traversé son histoire jusque-là. Et alors c'est à partir de ce moment-là qu'il a fallu en quelque sorte à la fois utiliser et mettre en question, essayer de problématiser l'homme en tant qu'il pouvait être disponible. D'où la question, qu'est-ce qu'on va en faire, comment appliquer cet individu à la croissance des forces productives, comment le discipliner, comment construire des grands corps politiques, etc. Et je crois qu'on a eu là toute une technologie de l'homme qui s'est développée à partir de ce moment-là, qui est la question de l'homme. Est-ce que cette question durera autant que l'humanité? Peut-être pas.
Peut-être pas.
We could have somebody just close the door over there. Does that door close? 'Cause I think they're starting over in the next room. So in closing, I think that what I'm really arguing to you is that my work reveals that in France, the sort of social and political and cultural conflicts that have permeated the post-war period have all been orbiting around one central question. What does it mean in a modern, multicultural nation to be French? And we can see debates over this in things like the recent debate over the headscarf affair, when it was outlawed just a couple years ago for Muslim schoolgirls are no longer allowed to wear headscarves to school, right? Or in the riots that took place all through France in October of 2005, right? We can see that this question, what does it mean to be French, who qualifies as French, has yet to be resolved. And the stakes of this investigation are very high. For the French, philosophy has long been a way of inculcating this notion of Frenchness into the public. And so we see them seizing on philosophy as a way of ensuring that if you're educated in this particular way, okay, you will be more French. Right? Now, the stakes of this kind of question are very high because they extend beyond the boundaries of France. And they raise issues that really strike at the heart of our understandings of the role of education. What can education do in a democratic society? Of this relationship between high and popular culture. How do we resolve, like, the relationship between philosophy, which is really high culture, and the emergence of visual culture, television? This is how most people learn about the world these days, right? They watch TV. Of the effects of the media on the intellectual field, and really about the very survival of national identities in a globalizing world. What does it mean now for television when we're facing satellite technology, right? Cable, network, all of these things. How do you retain a sense of national identity in the face of American hegemony, for example? So these are the kinds of things that I think an examination of the televising of philosophy in France can give us some insights into and raise questions for us about how other nations also achieve this through the use of the media. And that's basically what I want to share with you today. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. Okay, thank you.
So if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask them.
You can stand at the mic or you can speak loudly.
You were speaking of how the French state controlled the television up until
1982.
1982.
Uh-huh.
So is it totally private there now, or is it partly controlled by the state and
Good
partly
question.
public?
Okay, so the question is, is television totally private now, or is it partially public and partially private? It is part and part. There are France 2 and France 3. There are a number of public stations, and there are a whole slew of private stations. Some of them are what we call terrestrial channels. They're not satellite, right? And then we have a multiplication of hundreds and hundreds, just like in the United States, of cable channels and things like that, which are all private at this point. And what is interesting is that those philosophy shows that I mentioned from the 1990s, the 8 shows that came on the air, almost all of them were on public TV. So we can see that the government, this is part of a government agenda to like get philosophy across to the public. But yeah, so it's a mix now. But when we look at sort of major networks are half and half, pretty much. Okay, thanks. Anything else? Yes?
You mentioned at the end about the role of assimilation in modern French society. That's also something we see in like a larger European integration. How would you see the role of philosophy as a whole? Would it grow to a European side? Or
Right.
is it something that they would try to use as a nationalist identity?
Right, right. It's a really interesting question. It's funny. In the aftermath of World War II, there's an organization called UNESCO, which is based in Paris, actually. And they did a study of European countries, of the role of philosophy in European countries, because one of the things that they argued was that it was because not enough countries studied philosophy that we went to war. Now there's a big argument, okay? That if we had a really educated public, okay, if we educate our public so that the public knows how to think critically, then they're going to make smart decisions and they're going to be good citizens and they're not going to get us into horrific things like the Holocaust, right? We're not going to end up with genocides and things like that. And they repeat this in 1995. UNESCO, which is this big organization, goes out and does a worldwide study of the status of philosophy around the world. And the argument that they make is that anywhere that democracy goes, philosophy follows. So the minute that you have a country that becomes a democratic country, okay, then philosophy starts to be taught in the high schools and in the universities. A very interesting argument. I'm not sure, that we can completely back it up everywhere. But what we do see, and your question is interesting from the perspective of, okay, if the French are saying philosophy is ours, it's all about Frenchness, then what do we do with like European Union integration, et cetera, et cetera? Do we want to spread that out there? Well, a sort of contradiction which is inherent in the notion of what it means to be French is that the French also think that they have a purchase on universalism. If we think back to the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, Napoleon, we're going to go out and conquer all of Europe, right? We're going to take and we're going to spread all of these universal ideals, which are ours, but they're really good, and you should all have them. It's sort of that idea, okay? France, philosophy, it's ours. They're really good. You should have them too, okay? But not quite to the extent that we do, maybe. Could sort of argue, I think, a little bit. That it still remains something that is, there's a fundamental sort of Frenchness about intellectual culture. People are very proud of that there. So it's a little bit of a contradiction inside of it. It's a good question. Yeah. Anything else? Yes?
Does the French government as intensely promote the philosophy today as it does in the 20th century?
Does it as intensely promote philosophy today as in the 20th century? Well, we certainly have not had that same, those television shows, a lot of them end by the 1998, 99. So we start to see sort of a drop-off afterwards. I think that there's a little bit of a decline in the promotion of philosophy at the moment, but you still do see quite a bit of it. I mean, in what was it, 2004, there were 8 bestsellers which were popular philosophy books. And we still see popular philosophy books hitting the bestseller list and selling, 100,000, 500,000 copies, which is unheard of. For the United States, we wouldn't tend to have that kind of thing happening. So it's still important, but I think there are specific moments in French history when it's more important than others, and I would argue that it's during the 90s, there's sort of a crisis about national identity that happens in the aftermath of the end of communism, et cetera, that sort of pushes it into the public eye, and that it's sort of stepped back from that a little bit right now, and we'll see whether it happens again. I mean, I don't know. But yeah, good question. Yes?
What counts as philosophy? We've talked about assimilation. To what extent do these programs ever discuss non-Western philosophers?
Right.
If they do so, do they say, oh, well, here's a reflection of French truth?
Right.
Let's paint it more clearly?
Right. So-
And I think today, I mean, Tariq Ramadan,
Right.
high status, high profile intellectual, but how common is that?
Okay. So the question is, who counts as a philosopher in France? And does this include non-Western figures? Okay. Largely the focus is on Western figures. Largely the focus is on French men. There are very few women ever seen on television as philosophers. Even actually French female philosophers who do exist rarely appear on TV. So there is definitely a focus sort of on the white male French philosopher. By the same token, there was something else you were saying that I was going to address. The whole question of what does it mean to be, who is a philosopher, right? When you start a study like this and you're trying to determine, well, who am I actually going to look at, right? I mean, what I did, I went over to France. I was thinking about the fact that these guys seem to be so famous. I went to the television archive. I went to the database. I punched into the database philosophy. And bang, I had 3,500 hits. And I thought, oh my goodness, what the hell are these people watching? That they've got all these shows on philosophy. But then the question is, who are they? Who are the philosophers? How do I know who these guys are, right? Or women, okay? So in order to figure that out, because one of the things that makes you a philosopher in France is that you have to pass a very high exam. It's called the agrégation. And if you pass that exam, then you're considered to have attained the highest level of philosophical training, okay? So that qualifies you as a philosopher. But for my work, what I actually did is I let the media tell me who philosophers were. So if someone was called a philosopher on French TV, I said, aha, they're a philosopher. Okay? Whether they'd actually had philosophical training or not, I used them in my corpus because it's one of the things that sort of methodologically, how do you figure out who you're looking at and who you're not looking at? Because some people sort of cross those boundaries, like Bourdieu, who's actually a sociologist, or Levi-Strauss, who's trained as a philosopher and ends up in anthropology, or stuff like that. So basically, I let the media determine that. But largely, it is Western. There is some looking at sort of people from the Orient, but much, much, much less. Much less, yeah. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much for your attention, and enjoy the rest of your week and for inviting me here. I appreciated it.